Arriving at Kansas City International Airport shortly after 10:30 a.m. on Sunday, May 23rd, Owen was picked up by fan Trey Lindstrom, as was the drill whenever the WWF stormed through Missouri. Owen befriended fans in various cities. While many wrestlers scoffed at the notion of getting involved with their fans on a personal level, Owen quite enjoyed their company and treated them with respect. After checking into his hotel, the two arrived at Kemper Arena at lunchtime on a beautiful sunny day. Dubbed Mid-America's premier venue for concerts, sporting events, touring shows, and national conventions, the 19,500-seat facility was located in the heart of Kansas City's stockyards. It was there cattlemen from across the Midwest used to gather at the Kansas City Stock Exchange building to buy and sell cattle for slaughter. It seemed an appropriate place for the WWF to frequent, given the way Vince McMahon had treated his beefy talent like chattel over the years, as he was overheard saying on numerous occasions, talent can be replaced. Eating lunch at Kemper 6 hours before showtime, the two were approached by Bobby Talbert, a rigger out of Orlando, Florida, hired by the WWF to coordinate the stunt that would lower Owen into the ring from the rafters. After introducing himself to Owen, Talbert boasted that he was one who had overseen the exact same stunt several times with Sting, the wrestler from the rival World Championship Wrestling loop. Alluding to the fact that Vince McMahon was unhappy with the speed and fumbling that occurred with a somewhat similar drop in an entrance made by Owen in St. Louis 6 months earlier. Talbert said the addition of a quick-release snap shackle would make all the difference in the world. Owen, he was lowered to the canvas. Owen would simply have to tug lightly on a release cord that would disengage the repelling line from his harness. Within a split second, he would be free to move around the ring. Having spent the morning rigging up the elaborate setup of racks and rope in the rafters of the arena with two city riggers and his assistant, Matt Allman, Talbert had allegedly already run 2 clean tests of the system. The first was done with a 250-pound sandbag, the second with Allman strapped into the harness. It's unclear to this day whether these tests were run with the quick-release snap shackle to be used with Owen or a locking carabiner, if I said that correctly, which is the industry safety standard. Either way, Talbert was very lucky that both descents were made cleanly and efficiently while he manually controlled the pressure applied to the nylon repelling rope as it ran through the rescue rack. Everything seemed fine to Talbert, so it was time for a dry run with Owen in the harness. Owen politely declined. "I've done it before," he said. "It's no big deal," shrugged Owens, and he continued to eat his lunch. Extremely uncomfortable with the vertical drop and the heights involved, Owen simply did not want to subject himself to any more terrifying experiences that he absolutely had to. In one of his 2 previous high-level stunts, he told me he almost fell, compounding his fears. He hated every minute of those stunts, whether it was for rehearsal or the real thing. If at all possible, he wanted to limit the number of descents he'd have to endure. Talbert sensed Owen was being cocky about it. He just seemed disinterested in rehearsing. Informed it was a different setup than he had ever used before, Owen was urged again by Talbert to familiarize himself with the equipment. As well, they had never worked together, so it was in everybody's best interest for them to go over everything first. Steve Taylor, The WWF's VP of Event Operations got involved in the conversation, again asking Owen to try the entrance at least once before showtime. After all, tonight was the night Owen's Blue Blazer character was to win the Intercontinental title over a colorful, pimp-like character named The Godfather. Asked earlier in the week for his jacket measurements and informed he'd be making an aerial entrance, Owen had been assured by the WWF that top rigging experts from Los Angeles had been hired to ensure the stunt was done safely. Still, it was no secret Owen did not want to do the stunt. He wondered aloud on several occasions why he couldn't just stick to wrestling in the interviews. However, having argued with scriptwriters so often of late over his insistence on being excluded from lurid storylines, he felt he could ill afford to continue butting heads with WWF brass much longer. Despite his stature on the talent roster, there was an inherent job risk every time you begged off a storyline or a stunt. Everyone knew it. He didn't want to lose his job, so he said nothing to anyone of the consequence. What added to Owen's discomfort, though, were plans to have him descend into the ring with a midget wrestler named Max Mini, attached to his harness. As part of the spoof, the midget would be wearing an identical blue blazer outfit. Owen made it clear at that point he didn't want anything to do with it. That added responsibility of a second stuntman dangling from his belt line. I've got enough to worry about myself getting into the ring and undoing myself, Owen said. Although WWF officials had plans to continue with the double drop-in, Owen figured at that point the issue had been dropped. He was wrong. Owen's motive for begging out of the rehearsal had as much to do with inconvenience as fear. Actually aware of how incredibly disorganized and rushed rehearsals typically were the day of an event. He didn't want to waste time waiting around for people to get their act together. However, feeling pressure to appear the powers that be and to appease the powers that be, he reluctantly agreed to rehearse the aerial entrance at 2 p.m. when he said he'd return from his workout. 2 o'clock came and went and there was no sign of Owen. Extremely organized and generally quite prompt, Owen simply hoped his deliberate extended absence would ensure he could opt out of the rehearsal. As time ticked away, several WWF officials began asking around for Owen, anxious to see how the stunt speed would translate on television monitors. As Talbot, Allman, and several others waited for Owen, unsure when he might grace them with his presence, the call was made to scrap that evening's plan to include the midget in the stunt. It was decided time was getting desperately short and things would be too chaotic to try dropping them both in at the same time. Complicating matters was the fact that Max Mini didn't speak English and required the help of a translator to explain the particulars of the stunt and the danger involved if he were to pull his release cord too early. They decided they'd try the dual drop the next night in St. Louis. As Talbot would later say, call it an act of God. Owen's deliberate stall tactics wound up saving Max Mini's life. Upon Owen's return to the arena at 3:30 p.m., he tried again to pass off rehearsal, saying, I'll be all right. It didn't work. Climbing to the rafters mere feet below the 85-foot-high roof, Owen white-knuckled his way along a steel-grated catwalk that was ill-designed for pedestrians. High atop the southwest corner of the ring, he stood on the catwalk with Talbot, staring down at the large scoreboard below that he'd soon slide past on his way to the ring. As he assembled his harness, Talbot later claimed to have briefed Owen on the importance of not touching the quick-release cord before the landing in the ring. As long as you don't put your hands on this, nothing's going to happen, Talbot allegedly reassured him. When you get to the floor, you grab it and give it a deliberate pull upwards, so it gives me a visual cue to pull the rope back up. Despite having difficulty in trying to keep his cape from interfering with his arm movement, the test went relatively well. However, upon landing, Owen forgot to pull the release cord, prompting several WWF officials to scream and yell at him as he moved around the ring with the rope still attached to him. Asked if he wanted to try it a second time, the answer was a quick, "No, I got it." Like most wrestling pay-per-views, action in the ring began long before the show was broadcast to the masses. During one of the preliminary warm-up matches, Vince McMahon was mugged by a group of wrestlers dubbing themselves Corporate Ministry and led by Vince's son, Shane McMahon. In an effort to prevent from being a special guest referee later in the night, one of the wrestlers smashed a steel chair over Vince's leg. The crowd went wild. To play up the seriousness of the staged injury, the WWF had requested in advance the use of an ambulance and 2 paramedics for a segment showing McMahon being treated and transported out of the arena to the hospital. Records show the WWF had never before asked the Metropolitan Ambulance Services Trust to attend the Kansas City shows. It simply wasn't necessary, as wrestlers were rarely hurt seriously in the ring. As the early matches progressed, Owen sat in the bowels of the arena, changing into his blue blazer singlet and electric blue tights. He laced up his patent blue and white wrestling boots and prepared for his match. Earlier in the evening, he had picked up the vest he was to wear for the stunt and angrily hurled it across the dressing room in frustration. The fall. Several wrestlers saw his rare display of emotion and discussed with him how much he hated the idea of the stunt. He was worried about the new setup, as well as the fact his cape kept getting in the way. Some tried joking with him to ease his fears, but Owen wasn't responding in his typically light-hearted way. He appeared gravely concerned. However, being the consummate professional he was, he hyped himself up for a backstage interview to be aired later in the show, and it went well. At 7 p.m., the Over the Edge pay-per-view show opened appropriately with The Undertaker, featuring an eerie graveyard segment. He promised tonight, darkness will seize the land. Destroy all you hold dear. The death and destruction theme would continue through the night. Amidst a shower of pyrotechnics, wrestler Kane and X-Pac entered the ring to defend their tag team championship belts against sexual chocolate Mark Henry and D'Lo Brown for the first match of the pay-per-view. Noticeably quiet as he made final preparations, Owen paced back and forth, prompting longtime colleague Dustin Runnels, that's right, Dustin Rhodes, aka Gold Dust, to ask if he was nervous. Owen admitted he was before Runnels assured him, "It'll be all right, brother." Owen placed his cape and mask into a duffel bag to help conceal his identity for the walk through the crowd to the rafters, but put on prison-like coveralls and wore a baseball cap pulled down over his face as well. Leaving his dressing room with the bag slung over his shoulder, Owen bumped into former wrestler Harley Race. Told by Owen he was very uncomfortable with the upcoming stunt. Right, told by Owen, now Race, this is Race, told by Owen he was very uncomfortable with the upcoming stunt. All the signs and signals were there. Race tried to put him at ease by joking, "Be careful with that rope, it doesn't break." Harley's wife, BJ, offered up a hug of comfort and asked if he felt better. "The only thing that makes me feel better is your cooking," said Owen. Owen proceeded down the hall to an elevator that took him from the basement of the arena to the main concourse. Walking briskly past hundreds of wrestling fans, he stared towards the ground of the gray brick concourse, hoping to remain anonymous as he headed for section 221. He hurried up several flights of stairs to the last row of nosebleeds in the building, then climbed a rickety wooden ladder to the catwalk. The catwalk obviously wasn't designed for heavy traffic. At first, Owen had to negotiate slowly around the floor beam, as well as a series of beams overhead, holding tightly to the railings on either side of the narrow catwalk. He then took a right-hand turn and white-knuckled it 30 feet past a series of light standards that would fully illuminate the building upon his spectacular entrance. His careful steps along the narrow catwalk were further complicated by dozens of plugs sticking out of electrical sockets. The fact that he had his bag in tow and his size 9.5 wrestling boots. Still, he continued his path towards the center of the arena's roof, careful not to look down at the sea of blue seats and patrons below, whose movement had a dizzying effect on Owen when he had peeked down in the few previous stunts. He made a left turn back towards the center of the arena. Now at the center point of the arena's catwalk system, he turned towards the massive scoreboard that hung well below him. He climbed under an electrical pipe, up a slight incline, and over a structure beam. The final stretch was particularly tough to negotiate due to the more than 100 feet of black nylon rappelling rope placed all along the graded floor. It was the same rope Owen would soon attach himself to. It was there, just south of the center of the arena, that he was greeted by Talbert at 7:10 p.m., half an hour before the stunt was to occur. Having said that he had worked in the stunt business for 7 years, Talbert was hired by the WWF as an independent contractor to design and set up riggings for Owen's descent, describing himself as a stunt coordinator and special rigger for Universal Studios in Florida. Talbert landed this job, his first with the WWF, based largely on the fact that he told the WWF he had 2 years of experience setting up the stunt for Sting. Given the fact that Owen's stunt was meant to be a parody of WCW's silly entrances, who better to hire than Talbert, who had originally executed the stunt for them? However, we later found out he was merely an assistant to Sting's stunt coordinator. A trusting soul who grew up in a house that never had the doors locked, Owen never questioned Talbert's abilities or qualifications. And why would he? After all, he was working for a billion-dollar company that assured him the best in the business had been hired to rig him. Despite meeting earlier in the day for the dry run, Talbert went over the stunt once more while Owen took off his coveralls and baseball cap. The only other men on the catwalk were city riggers James Williams and Jim Vinzant from Local 31 of the Teamsters. Earlier in the day, they had assembled various span sets and bridles in the arena ceiling as part of the rigged setup laid out by Talbert. During the show, their job was to simply monitor the stunt. Matt Ullman was positioned ringside. The railings and floor surrounding them had been covered by black cloth to conceal them as they prepared for the entrance. The second match of the night was a hardcore title fight showdown between Hardcore Holly and Al Snow, who typically enters the ring holding the severed head of a woman featuring the words "Help Me" scrawled backwards across her forehead, a prime example of how tasteless and insensitive the WWF during that era had become. What does everybody want? You guys remember that, right? In these matches, anything goes. Peering down on the action, Owen would have been seen the two hammering away on one another, with a fire extinguisher, a steel chair, a broken table, a metal pan, and the severed head of a deer, which doubles as Snow's imaginary friend, Pierre. Yeah, it was a little crazy during the Attitude Era, all brought on by ECW. Sting, do your own due diligence and research. And thanks for being here on Guardian of Chaos, the YouTube channel, for Chaos Corner and Story Time. You guys already get and understand what we're talking about and what we're reviewing here today. Broken Hearts, the story of Owen Hart. Let's continue. Vincent assisted preparations by shining a flashlight on Owen while Talbot helped him put on his rappelling harness, featuring 3 straps across the front and plenty of reinforcement to prevent tearing of any sort. The black harness fit much like a sleeveless life jacket. It also had straps that wrapped around his legs to further stabilize him while being lowered. With Owen securely fastened, Talbot then grabbed the end of the rope and attached the snap shackle device to the metal ring on the back of the harness. He pulled on the snap shackle device several times, once almost lifting Owen off his feet to ensure it was properly secured. Owen then put on his silly-looking blue, silver, and red mask, always pushing the fucking envelope, Vince, and you cost someone their life. Featuring holes cut out for his eyes, nose, and mouth, the mask had laces in the back used to secure it in place. With his movements somewhat limited in the confronted and confined space, Owen needed help from Talbot to put on his bright blue and red sequined cape. The sides of the cape, lined with the white feathers, were attached to Owen's hands by the way of elastic bands he continually readjusted throughout final preparation. The release cord, designed to quickly separate Owen from the rope upon ring entry, was then brought to the front of Owen's harness and secured to the upper right side of his chest using black gaff tape, similar to electrical tape. As designed, one quick tug on the cord would trigger the snap shackle and allow Owen free range in the ring. It only took 6 pounds of pressure to rid himself of the rope, and Talbot explained that Owen should pull it in a deliberate upward fashion, cueing Talbot to pull the rope back up. It was the same cord Owen forgot to pull during rehearsal, drawing the chorus of shouts from frustrated WWF officials angry at Owen's failure to execute the stunt fluidly. Well, none of you motherfuckers were doing this stunt. You weren't up there doing it, and I apologize for the cussing. This hits home with me. I spoke about this to Jim the Anvil Neidhart when we were on the road and when we worked together. I spoke with this when I had a chance to talk to Bret Hart when we made a couple of appearances together. This hits home here. And if you're a wrestling fan and against a big conglomerate of the WWF and what Vince McMahon has turned out to be, and the unnecessary stunts and dangers of this fucking business, and again, I apologize for the cussing, but this strikes a chord in me, and I hope it does for you too. These are facts. Minutes from his cue, Owen apparently moved his arms out and away from his body several times to reposition his cape in an effort to try and conceal his harness. The awkward cape was heavy and had a tendency to choke him if not positioned properly. The hardcore slugfest below had finally been won by Al Snow, eliciting a roar from what was said to be a crowd of 18,244 fans. That's right, over 18,000 fans and millions on pay-per-view watched this horrific event. While the event had indeed sold out in one day, capacity on a night hovered more realistically around 16,500. We know the inflated numbers of the pro wrestling industry, based on the size of the wrestler's elaborate entrance ramp, shrouded by metal girders and light stands for all the pyro. As the two exhausted combatants stumbled from the ring, there was a backstage broadcast interview updating fans on the physical condition of Vince McMahon, suggesting he had likely suffered a broken ankle and would be transported to the hospital once an ambulance arrived. In fact, the ambulance was already waiting in the house. The lights were then dimmed, the cue for Owen to steady himself for his descent. It was now 40 minutes into the show. Talbot instructed Owen to climb over the 4-foot hand railing and position himself on the outside of the scaffolding. Owen had trouble negotiating the maneuver, so Vincent facilitated things by lifting Owen's cape. The city rigger then retreated to ensure the rope would not get snagged anywhere on the catwalk's floor when Owen was to begin his manual descent. At first, facing away from Talbot, Owen turned and held onto the railing, trying not to look down. Talbot checked the tension of the equipment by lowering Owen a few feet, at which point the Cape Crusader let go of the railing, dangling with his shoulders parallel to the catwalk floor. Owen placed his hands on his harness and was ready to be lowered. He hung there for a few minutes. Everything seemed fine to Talbot. Down in the ring, a referee was clearing debris from the hardcore match. On the Jumbotron was a 40-second profile of the Blue Blazer. Perhaps being somewhat choked by the cumbersome cape, Owen extended his elbows out and away from his body in an effort to make a subtle adjustment. It was then the three riggers were horrified to hear the distinct sound of the snap shackles release. Talbot looked down immediately to see Owen plunging towards the ring, falling backwards in a slight clockwise spiral before landing violently 78 feet below. Several fans heard him scream in a terror all the way down. For most who were glued to the video montage on the Jumbotron, the first they saw of the Blue Blazer live that night was the split second before he savagely met the top rope of the wrestling ring, narrowly missing the metal post that supported the turnbuckle in the southwest corner of the ring. Owen's upper left side absorbed the violent impact of his plunge. Shattering his left arm just above the elbow and causing massive internal injuries upon initial contact, Owen was flipped backwards by the highly strung cable. His 229-pound body caromed into the ring, where it sprang a foot off the canvas before settling in the corner. Lying motionless on his back with his feet pointing towards the center of the ring and his head mere feet from the apron, it took several seconds for his rubbery arms to rest at his side after bouncing off the spring-like canvas. In a wrestling world in which Vince McMahon delights in thrilling audiences with shock and the element of surprise, the ragdoll figure hurtling into the ring drew a loud cheer from the crowd. Unable to grasp the seriousness of the moment, the majority of the fans briefly mistook Owen's horrific fall for a spectacular entrance. Others figured it was perhaps a mannequin. At least that's what they hoped. It quickly became clear something had gone terribly wrong. Unconscious due to the violent impact that tore his aorta and instantly began filling his lungs with blood, an innate survival reflex prompted the muscles and nerves of a wide-eyed Owen to attempt to sit up. Described by one man as looking like someone struggling to finish off a set of 100 abdomen, excuse me, fans, as I try to control my emotions, crunches with one final desperate attempt. Owen was unable to do much more than lift his masked head a few inches off the mat. His attempt at one final desperate breath finished with him returning his head to the mat and turning towards a ringside photographer, his eyes staring blankly ahead. As people tried figuring out what they had just seen, it became clear Owen wasn't the only one hurt. At the same time Owen's plunging body made contact with the ring rope, one of his flailing legs had struck the referee, clearing the ring, sending him sprawling to the canvas in pain. Several witnesses actually suggested Owen's screams were aimed at the ref, warning him to get out of the way. Confused by the shocking collision, the referee scampered out of the ring. He was one of several people who summoned immediate help for Owen and would later be taken to the hospital himself with back injuries. The crowd was quiet. A low murmur blanketed the arena. Another WWF referee stood over Owen, holding his head in disbelief. On the scoreboard Jumbotron, which Owen had just passed at 45 miles per hour, the Blue Blazer video rolled on. featuring brief footage of him descending into the ring via cable. Off-duty police officers Todd Bryant and Joe Daniff were working security 20 feet from the ring when Owen hit the mat. The frantic ringside cameraman sprinted over to summon the two uniformed men and told them Owen was hurt. Quickly convincing them the scenario was not staged or fake in any way, the two scaled a 3-foot retaining wall, separating spectators from ringside, where the first to tend to Owen less than a minute after his fall. Rest in peace, Owen Hart. Bryant clambered up the metal stairs and into the ring while Daniff positioned himself ringside alongside stunned commentator Jerry the King Lawler. Lawler, a former wrestler, had sprung from behind his TV monitor mere feet away to help out. Putting his hand over Owen's mouth, he said, "He's not breathing." Both Lawler and Daniff stabilized Owen's head by tilting it back towards the rafters from which he had plummeted. Bryant confirmed Owen was not breathing and had no pulse. Without wasting time and trying to remove Owen's vest, Bryant immediately began chest compressions. As several others joined the scene seconds later, Owen's tight-fitting mask was cut up the right side by the scissors and removed. Bryant turned his efforts towards mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, using the mask's thin material as a barrier device. Another uniformed officer, Jeffrey Cowdrey, entered the ring and took over chest compressions. He had been backstage watching Owen do a pre-match interview that's less than an hour earlier and was sure it was all some sort of wrestling angle until he saw Owen's lifeless glare. Backstage, Todd Coleman, one of the two ambulance attendants on hand to take part in McMahon's staged injury, was summoned to the ring. A member of the Kansas City Fire Department, Coleman worked part-time for emergency providers, which sent him and partner Stephen Underhill to be part of the show. Having just finished filming the second take of the mock McMahon injury seconds earlier, the two sprinted immediately from the south tunnel to the ring. The crowd was stunned, as were the two referees, who paced nervously around the ring, running their hands through their hair and periodically huddling over medics to survey the scene. A ringside cameraman stood 5 feet from the ring, capturing the rescue efforts on a tape never to be released to the public. The Blue Blazer introductory montage soon ended on the Jumbotron, with Owen raising his arms in triumph and parading out of the interview with one of his comical whoops. The arena was filled with little more than a low hum of voices. The sea of crude and comical signs that have become the trademark of raucous wrestling crowds were parked at people's feet while most stood in silence. It didn't take long for them to identify it was indeed Owen Hart in the ring, not a mannequin, and he was apparently clinging to life. Those watching on TV were oblivious to what had just transpired and were welcomed back from the Blue Blazer video intro by ringside commentator Jim Ross, who was sitting mere feet from Owen's lifeless body. As several other medical personnel rushed to join Bryant, Daniff, Coleman, and Lawler at the scene, Ross scrambled to divert the pay-per-view audience to an interview with the Blue Blazer taped earlier in the day. Clearly stunned by the shockingly violent entrance Owen made seconds earlier, Ross punctuated his brief cut in by saying, and I quote, "We've got big problems out here." That was a huge understatement. As the short, hokey interview entertained puzzled viewers, chest compressions continued. Seconds after his medic bag arrived in the ring, Coleman prepared to intubate. At the very same time, Coleman's wife was taping the pay-per-view, oblivious as to what had transpired minutes earlier. With the show coming to a screeching halt, the fans were now very much aware of the seriousness of the situation. The only sound other than the buzz of horrified wrestling fans was a smattering of well-intended catcalls bellowing out Owen's name. Meanwhile, TV viewers saw the taped interview with Owen wrap up with the Blue Blazers' trademark sign-off. One last thing in closing to all my little Blue Blazers: take your vitamins, say your prayers, and drink your milk, to quote Owen Hart, the Blue Blazer. Television viewers were then shown a live, wide shot of the Kemper Arena audience aimed far from the ring itself, with spectators standing to see several more medical personnel join in the rescue efforts. The camera turned to Ross, who explained the dire situation to millions of viewers the best way he could, and I quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, when you're doing live television, a lot of things can happen, and sometimes they're not good," said a suddenly pale-looking Ross, wearing a black cowboy hat, black WWF wrestling button up, and headset with a mic extension. Ross goes on to say, and I quote, "The Blue Blazer, as we know, is Owen Hart, was going to make a very spectacular superhero-like entrance from the rafters, and something went terribly wrong. This is a very serious situation here. This is not part of the entertainment here tonight. This is as real can be here right now. The EMTs are tending to Owen in the ring now. We are a little bit of a loss in this situation. I've been doing this for more years than I would like to admit, and this is one of the most shocking things I've ever seen. This is not your typical wrestling storyline. This is a real situation. I don't know if the harness broke or what the malfunction was. We're going to keep our cameras on the crowd at this point in time, simply because we are hoping to move on as best we can." Obviously directed by his production truck producer to fill in during this most awkward and serious situation, a shaken Ross proceeded to throw to a 2-minute preview of a mixed tag team match featuring Owen's former partner Jeff Jarrett and his sidekick Deborah. When the preview ended, Ross was once again handed the burden of trying to hold the broadcast together despite the horrific gravity of the situation. And I quote Jim Ross once again, "This is not a wrestling angle. This is real life. We're not going to put this on television. It's not a sensationalistic attempt to leave a mark here on this event. We'll have the rest of this broadcast, but the bigger issue now is that a human being, Owen Hart, has been terribly injured here on this live broadcast. Something's going wrong with the equipment as he was being lowered. We don't know what malfunctioned. Obviously, something in the apparatus, we assume, went wrong, unless Owen inadvertently released himself before he was near the ring. Right now, nothing is more important than the health and the welfare of not only a great athlete, but a very unique and good human being." Visibly shaken, Lawler returned to Ross from ringside. And I quote the King, "No, it doesn't look good at all," was all he said. Several minutes after his fall, Owen's body began to change color. His systems had shut down, turning his skin an ashen gray. There were no vital signs, and Owen wouldn't respond in any way to the efforts of paramedics. His eyes remained open, staring blankly ahead. I'm sorry to bring this graphic story to you fans, but this is reality, and I felt like I had to cover this. All these years later, I've been waiting to do this, and today was the day that I decided to tackle this issue. Underhill arrived in the ring with fiberglass spine board. Coleman's efforts then turned to the intubation, which was complicated by the musculature of Owen's neck. It was a task made even more difficult as a man who identified himself as a WWF doctor began hampering the rescue efforts. Unable to speak fluent English, the man reached into Coleman's paramedic bag and grabbed monitor paddles used to shock patients with bad heart rhythms. However, with no monitorable heartbeat, an agitated Coleman insisted the man put the paddles down. The man reacted by trying to pull Owen's chest harness off. Coleman demanded the man stop what he was doing and step away. The man refused to move and wound up doing some brief chest compressions on Owen. Once the airway was established minutes later by a rigged stylet used to form the tube, air had been pumped into his lungs while Owen was carefully log-rolled onto the spine board. With so many medics milling around the ring, causing a disruptive amount of movement, it was decided further treatment could not be administered on site. It wasn't safe. It was chaotic. Owen's limp body was then pulled under the ropes and placed on cot, prompting a loud cheer from the stunned audience. Cowdrey immediately jumped aboard the gurney, straddled Owen, and continued chest compressions while being wheeled along the ramp. As the growing number of emergency personnel escorted him out of the arena, chants of "Owen! Owen! Owen!" filled the arena air. By this time, 8 minutes had elapsed since Owen's fall, and there were no signs of medical progress. Owen's lips had turned blue as cyanosis progressed and his body was depleted of oxygen. Time was getting desperately short. As the entourage of medical personnel wheeled Owen from the ring, Cowdrey heard one disgusting fan yell, "This is a fucking fake." Many others, however, had tears in their eyes and offered up words of encouragement for their fallen hero. Meanwhile, the pay-per-view coverage returned to the massive stadium screens as Deborah and Owen's tag team partner, Jeff Jarrett, struggled to hold back tears during a live backstage interview aimed at hyping the upcoming match. Wheeled out of the arena to the building's south loading dock, Owen and the rescue workers breezed by a group of teary-eyed wrestlers who had been watching the scene backstage, consoling one another. Several wrestlers, including The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, desperately wanted to rush to the ring to try to help Owen. They were ordered to remain behind the entrance curtains for fear their emergence would have sent the crowd into a frenzy and might have led to many to believe the fall was part of the show. As several wrestlers offered their own words of encouragement for their wounded warrior, Owen was taken to the waiting ambulance. His emotional wrestling colleagues mobbed the area where the ambulance had been parked. Coleman and crew hauled Owen past the horde and climbed into the ambulance with Cowdrey, who continued his CPR efforts while dripping with sweat. The alleged WWF doctor continued to get in the way by somehow gaining entrance into the vehicle. After bellowing ridiculously inappropriate instructions to watch his arm, the stranger was finally removed by Underhill. Demanding he be allowed to stay because he was a doctor, Underhill asked him if he'd sign a doctor intervention form. When he refused, he was pulled from the ambulance and the back doors were closed to keep wrestlers out and allow medics to continue their work unimpeded. It was also done to prevent videotaping of the incident by a roving WWF cameraman intent on capturing the ugly scene on film. Coleman and Cowdrey continued trying to get solid CPR established and force oxygen into Owen's system. Owen and his cot were secured. A cervical collar was placed on him and he was hooked up to a monitor. It was then Coleman established Owen still had electrical activity in his heart, but the heart wasn't actually beating. It was deemed an agonal or dying heart rhythm, meaning he had yet to flatline. A shot of atropine was administered in an effort to raise his heart rate. It had no response. Owen's eyes remained fixed and dilated. Since the ambulance had been hired to act as standby for Vince's fake injury, company policy for emergency providers dictated that the paramedics wait for another ambulance to transport Owen to the hospital. The first ambulance was supposed to stay for the duration of the hire. However, as precious time ticked away, several distraught wrestlers began to demand that Owen be transported immediately. At one point, The Rock leaned into the driver's side of the cab and began yelling, "Who's driving this motherfucker?" At the same time, another wrestler jumped into the passenger side. Underhill tried to explain to The Rock they had to wait for another ambulance and that Owen was being stabilized for transport. This statement was met with increasing anger. Underhill also told the identified grappler to leave the ambulance immediately. He complied. At this point, Underhill and Coleman agreed the mob surrounding the ambulance had grown hostile, too emotional. There were things getting out of hand, with no one attempting to control the emotional group clustered around the vehicle. It provided too much of a distraction for ambulance attendants to fully focus on Owen. A judgment call was made to leave the building. En route to the Truman Medical Center, just 3 miles away, epinephrine was administered into Owen's airway tube. It also hooked up to an IV seconds before he was taken out of the ambulance at Truman. In Coleman's opinion, however, Owen was already clinically dead. When any fall greater than 20 feet occurs in the Kansas City area, there is an automatic activation of the hospital's trauma team, which consists of 4 top doctors. They quickly assembled for Owen's arrival, and the CAT scan technician was also put on alert. It had now been slightly more than 20 minutes since his fall with Owen's arrival at 7:59 p.m. The team, headed up by Dr. Michael Rush, wheeled him into the trauma room for a final desperate attempt to save his life. However, they were well aware of Owen's grave condition via radio transmissions. His Glasgow Coma Scale, a measure of neurological function, was listed as a 3 out of 15. It obviously wasn't looking good. 2 units of O-negative blood were at the ready for possible transfusion. Nurse Michael Tucker was brought up to date on the situation by paramedics as Owens was reeled through the emergency room doors and into Truman Medical Center. After transferring Owens' body from the ambulance cot to the bed in Trauma Room 1, several attendants had problems removing Owens' vest. With help from Tucker, who had to cut a shoulder strap and several belts off the garment, it was removed. The laces of his boots were also cut right up the middle. Electrocardiogram pads were immediately placed on Owen's chest in search of any recordable heart rhythm. The initial reading from the cardiac monitor indicated he was asystole, if I pronounced that correctly, meaning he had no sign of heart activity whatsoever. However, seconds later, there were signs of a light PEA, which is the pulseless electrical activity. It meant the heart was not beating, but faint electrical activity was still apparent. He was still fighting for his life. This offered a brief moment of hope. As dire as the situation appeared, reviving patients from PEA to a shockable rhythm wasn't beyond the realm of possibility. Both Tucker and Rush had seen it happen before. At this point, all those who transported Owen to the hospital, except Cowdrey, had left the room. He stood in the doorway, sadly anticipating what was to come. Nurses began calling out observations to Tucker, who recorded the findings. Owen's skin was blue. His lips were colorless and his skin was cold to the touch. Nurses reported he had no bowel sounds and his abdomen was soft. One side noted there was no sign of alcohol on his breath, which was listed as bilateral and equal, maintained only by tireless CPR efforts. Owen's eyes remained open and fixed ahead. revealing no sign of life whatsoever. That his pupils dilated to 5 millimeters, nearly twice normal, was yet another ominous sign. Owen had an open fracture above his left elbow, and a cut below those wounds were of little concern. A large bruise on his left lateral chest was further proof his heart had quite likely suffered from irreversible damage. While fears escalated that he had, by now, suffered brain damage, the only thing that mattered was that he regained consciousness. 4 minutes later, in an effort to stimulate the heart, a 16-gauge IV catheter inserted earlier in his left arm by paramedics was used to feed Owen's unresponsive body with epinephrine. It immediately blew the vein. A minute later, another amp of epinephrine was administered, if I'm saying that correctly. Bear with me. Through an endotracheal tube. Then at 8:06 p.m., a large IV was placed at the right groin to pump in more epinephrine and atropine. If I'm saying that correctly, bear with me, fans. Bear with me, please. Thank you for being here. Much love and respect to everyone who's going through this with me here right now on Chaos Corner. Still, monitors recorded no signs of progress, no pulse. His heart continued to show slight electrical activity, but nothing of significance. Very little hope remained as the precious minutes ticked away. Outside in the waiting room, retired wrestler Harley Race paced anxiously, awaiting word on his longtime pal. He would later be joined by Jeff Jarrett, still in full wrestling gear, and a host of concerned wrestlers who numbered close to 24 by night's end. At 8:07, a final amp of epinephrine and atropine went into Owen's right femoral line. 4 minutes later, he was still unresponsive. CPR continued for a final few minutes until doctors determined all resuscitation efforts were futile. 13 minutes after arriving at the hospital, 33 minutes since the fall, all work on Owen Hart was stopped. At 8:12 p.m. Central Standard Time, the supervising doctor called code. At age 34, Owen was dead. Eye drops were placed in Owen's eyes by Tucker for the purposes of possible donation. Unfortunately, the request for organ donation was never made. Certainly would have consented as per Owen's wishes, his family said. His belongings were collected by Detective Cowdrey for the criminal investigation that began immediately. The medical examiner was called. The doctors were interviewed by police, and detectives were dispatched to Kemper to secure the scene in an effort to piece together what went wrong. Wearing nothing but a pair of white socks, Owen's naked, lifeless body was covered by a white sheet. Meanwhile, the show went on. Thank you, fans, for being here. I greatly appreciate you going through this journey with me here today on Chaos Corner. Broken Hearts, The Life and Death of Owen Hart by Martha Hart. Rest in peace, Owen. I'm sorry it took so long for me to get to this chapter. I will return to do the next chapter of the book entitled The Call. As Martha Hart stated, and I quote, "They don't even realize their little lives are changed forever." I'll say that to say this, because I tell it like it is. Rest in peace, Owen Hart. Thank you, fans. Come on back. We'll continue with the Owen Hart story.